Don't look now, but Corvettes are blazing performance bargains. But can a retro Corvette like mine be an ideal first car? In this video, I'll give you the pros and cons of owning a C4 or C5 Corvette for the young, budget-minded driver. And as a bonus, I'll give you 2 more recommendations for affordable, fun retro sports cars that I've also owned for the young or young at heart. Welcome to Retro Cars Forever. My name is Brad, and I want to thank all of you out there for the idea of today's video. You see, I've gotten several comments here on my channel and messages on my Instagram asking me if the 4th or even the 5th gen Corvette would make a good first car or a fun car for a younger driver. These 2 generations are the cheapest Corvettes you can buy and still drive every day, so this is a great idea for a video. Let's start with the positives. Value. A big plus of buying a retro Corvette is relative affordability. I'm going to assume that most young drivers don't have a lot of cash to burn. So thankfully, C4 and C5 Corvettes represent a lot of car for the money. If you stay away from expensive special editions like a Grand Sport or a Z06, and just go for a good, solid base Corvette, 9 to 17 grand is the going rate for good examples. And you can go all the way down to 6 grand for a ragged but running example. Now, if that price range is out of your budget, I have 2 more fun first car alternatives later in this video that are cheaper to buy and operate. But you won't find anything for the Corvette's price range with this much performance. For better or for worse, we all know how much younger drivers crave speed, and for today's money, nothing goes, stops, or turns better than a retro Vette. Trust me, I've looked. Plus, it's a freaking Corvette. You will probably be the only kid in school that can say that they own one. It's an impressive name that everyone knows. Image matters a lot to young drivers, and these Corvettes still have style that you can't help but love. Those adolescent years are full of challenges, and sometimes you just need to feel good. Thankfully, the right Corvette can be your own little slice of heaven. You'll have a blast popping the headlights, popping the top, and just soaking in all that life has to offer you. Every single drive in a Corvette makes you feel special and awesome. Just the ticket for those turbulent teenage years. So if you're a young driver and that's all you want to hear, probably best you don't show your folks this next part. Now I'm going to cover the negatives of young retro Corvette ownership, and unfortunately, there are a few of them, starting with safety. Safety is a real concern for younger drivers because they are way more likely to be involved in an accident. According to a study by Safe Roads Alliance, in your first year of driving, you have a whopping 43% chance of getting into some sort of car crash and a 37% chance in your second year. Because of that, I'd only recommend Corvettes made after 1992 for younger drivers. By that point, every Vette had anti-lock brakes and traction control, as well as a driver's side airbag, with a passenger side airbag added in 1994. Even more improvements in structural safety and stability control arrived with the 5th generation C5. But no matter what year you get, safety is always a concern with Corvettes because of how low to the ground they are. Corvette bumpers just don't line up with the taller vehicles that take up a majority of the road these days, and it's easy for them to ride up and over the entire hood of a Vette. And those taller vehicles have a hard time even seeing your Corvette in traffic. You have to drive defensively towards other drivers that are unaware of your very presence, and that's extra thought and skill that a beginning driver might not have. Speaking of skill, Corvettes can be a challenge to drive at the limit for novice drivers. The downside of owning a fast car with high limits like a Vette is how quickly and badly things can go once those limits are passed. One of my first cars, this 1991 Cougar that you see here, was a total dog by comparison. But thankfully, I wasn't going that fast whenever I lost control, which was often. So if I spun off the road or made a mistake, nothing too terrible happened because of how slow I was going. Since then, I've owned around 20 other cars, and I'm grateful that I gradually worked my way up to faster and faster vehicles before finally ending up with my Corvette, which is the fastest of them all. And it's not just raw speed that can get inexperienced drivers in over their head with Corvettes, because they can be tricky to drive at the limit, at least until you get used to them. Even as an experienced driver, it took me a while to figure out how to pilot my Corvette at speed. I was either fighting understeer where the front end would push wide, or dealing with abrupt snap oversteer where the rear end would step out unexpectedly. Eventually, I figured out how to drive this strange beast smoothly, and once you get the knack of it, Corvettes are wonderful cars to drive fast. But I'm not sure I would have had the patience or the skill set for such advanced vehicle dynamics back in high school when I was this guy. Maybe that's why insurance costs for Corvettes, like all other sports cars, are much higher than your typical automobile. While I couldn't find any solid data for used Corvette insurance costs for younger drivers, according to MoneyGeek.com, on average, any sports car, like a Ford Mustang for example, will cost 45% more for a teen to insure than, say, a Toyota Camry, which works out to an extra $1,300 a year to insure a sports car. Another downside of that impressive Corvette V8 performance is how hard it'll hit your wallet at the pumps. You can realistically expect 20 to 24 miles per gallon on the highway, which isn't too bad, but that drops to around 10 to 13 miles per gallon in city traffic. And remember, almost all Corvettes require premium fuel, so you'll be flipping a lot of burgers to pay for your Corvette's gas bill. The simple act of parking is hard enough for inexperienced drivers, but it's even harder in a retro Corvette. The turning circle is huge, so it's hard to place the car in tight quarters. The long nose is far away, which makes it challenging to judge where the front corners are. And on top of all that, the lower air dam is easily damaged by curbs or cement blocks if you park too far forward. Even after 3 years of daily driving my Corvette, I still occasionally misjudge that one. And finally, let's touch on reliability. While I think C4 and C5 Corvettes are decently reliable for what they are, we are talking about complex vehicles that are now 2 or 3 decades old, with all the fancy switches, buttons, and doodads of a luxury car, any of which can fail at any time. For example, my old power seat rack. Even the nicest Corvettes are gonna need much more care, attention, and money to keep going when compared to your average hand-me-down, lightly used Toyota or Honda sedan. Even finding a good repair shop to work on a retro Corvette can be a challenge. Your best bet is a Corvette or old car specialist, which are gonna have higher labor rates than your typical shop. Figure $100 an hour for a business that actually knows what they're doing with your specialized car. However, if you're a backyard mechanic or if you're looking for a parent-child project, you'll find retro Corvette ownership to be a lot more manageable. Most parts are plentiful and affordable, with several parts websites dedicated to Corvettes to choose from, and most jobs are pretty easy to tackle at home. Doing your work yourself can save you a lot of money. In any case, you can stack the deck in your favor by getting what I consider to be the most reliable model years. For C4s, I recommend the last 2 years, which are 1995 and 1996. I go into more detail why in my C4 Buyer's Guide video here, which also covers the different model year changes and values. Definitely a video I'd suggest if you're considering buying one of these cars. For C5s, I'd also advise looking for the later model years, as the 1997 to 2000 model years are known for faulty electronic brake control modules. That module controls the ABS, traction control, and stability control systems, which I think are all must-haves for novice drivers. This early module is nearly impossible to repair, and there aren't any new replacement parts for it, so your only option is a pricey used or refurbished unit, which is only going to buy you more time until they end up failing. So if you want a C5, get a 2001 to 2004 model to avoid this headache. One more Corvette buyer's choice that I'd like to touch on. Should a beginning driver go with an automatic transmission or a manual? Personally, as a seasoned enthusiast who loves canyon carving, I'm always going to choose the manual. But for a first car, I actually recommend the automatic. There's so many rules of the road that beginning drivers need to learn, and shifting gears can be a major distraction from that. And the stick shifts in these Corvettes are even harder to master than most other cars. Their clutches are stiff, and the shifter action isn't the smoothest. Plus, there are weird quirks like the 4+3 overdrives in the early C4s or the CAG's skip shifting mechanism in the later cars that make the learning curve even steeper. And it's not like a Corvette with an automatic is a terrible driving experience. I've driven plenty of C4s and C5s with automatics, and I still found them to be fun and engaging cars. The torquey V8 works well with the automatic, and it's easy to just hop in and drive. As a bonus, you'll have a much easier time scoring a deal on an automatic-equipped Retrovette. That's because 3 out of 4 Corvettes of this era were ordered with automatics, so they're much easier to find and go for a few grand less than manuals do. Now, if owning a vintage Corvette is out of your youthful budget range, don't fret, because I have 2 fun rear-wheel drive sports car alternatives from the same era that might make a lot more sense to a younger driver. And crucially, both of these alternatives are much easier to work on, repair, and keep going than a Corvette. My 2 alternatives are the Ford Mustang GT and the Mazda MX-5 Miata. I've owned a few versions of each of these cars, and I found they each represent 80% of the Corvette style and performance at half the cost. Pretty good math to a younger person on a budget. So let's start with the Ford Mustang, one of the easiest cars to learn the all-important art of burnouts and donuts in. For a first car, I'd recommend the SN95 generation, which ran from 1994 to 2004, with the later model years, like this yellow one here, having edgier styling and more power. I once owned this 1994 GT convertible, and later this 2001 GT Bullet Edition. Just like with the Corvettes, the best value isn't pursuing a special edition Mustang like my Bullet, or the Cobra, or even the 40th anniversary edition like we featured in the Women React to Cars ranking series. And by the way, check that out next if you want to see what single ladies really think of these Mustangs. In any case, the best bang for your young buck is going to be your garden variety GT version, which will have a dead simple V8 that packs anywhere between 215 to 260 horsepower. That's less than most Corvettes, but still plenty of juice to have fun with, even with the optional automatic transmission. Plus, they sound great. Take a listen to this stock exhaust. And while Mustangs don't handle as well as a Corvette, they do sit up nice and high, so there aren't any issues of visibility or curb clearance. Plus, you get a back seat for carrying around your friends, at least for short trips. And Mustangs are the perfect car for learning auto repair. I got over my fear of working on my own cars by learning a lot of lessons with my Mustangs. Oh no! There it went. Now, as far as gas mileage with these V8 Mustangs goes, it's still pretty crappy. But at least they don't require premium like the Corvettes do. And these SN95 Mustangs are screaming deals right now. 5 to 10 grand is all it costs to buy a good example. Okay, I know some of you Chevy diehards are screaming at the screen. A Ford? How come you're not recommending the F-body Camaro of this era instead? Look, I love Camaros too, but nowadays they're nowhere near the amazing value that the Mustang represents. In the 90s and 2000s, Ford sold 3 times as many Mustangs as Chevy sold Camaros. So these days, Camaros are much rarer and about as expensive to buy as a Corvette. And unlike the Corvette, or especially the Mustang, these Camaros can be royal pains to work on, especially when it comes to their difficult engine or fuel tank access. So if you're young, on a tight budget, but still want cheap American V8 fun, I'd highly recommend a Mustang GT. But what if handling matters to you more than straight line speed? Then the answer is always Miata. For young buyers on a budget, I'd recommend the first, second, and the beginning of the 3rd generation. I've personally logged plenty of miles in my dad's 1st gen Miata, I've happily owned this 2nd gen example, and I've driven my buddy's 3rd gen on a few occasions and enjoyed all of them immensely. The years I'd recommend for a young buyer start in 1994, when the Miata got dual airbags and better crash bracing, all the way up to the first few years of the 3rd gen, which are still pretty inexpensive if you buy one made before their 2009 refresh. Okay, by then these were just called MX-5s, but come on, it's a Miata. Whatever the name, the later versions are more comfortable, faster, and safer, especially with their standard roll bars. But their earlier cars are lighter, simpler, and most importantly of all, have pop-up headlights. Hey, that counts for a lot. No matter what Miata you choose, be aware that it's much smaller inside than either the Mustang or the Corvette, and won't do as well in an accident with a bigger vehicle. But because Miatas have half the cylinder count of those American V8s, they get much better fuel economy. 21 to 28 miles per gallon is about the norm. And while they won't win any drag races, Miatas are wonderful cars for beginners because they feel fast even while driving at legal speeds. Miatas are lightweight and responsive, so they're a great way to learn vehicle dynamics without getting in over your head. One negative is the optional automatic transmissions on these cars, which do sap a lot of the fun out of the driving experience. But thankfully, the manuals are some of the smoothest and slickest out there and easy to learn. In fact, I recently taught my younger sister to drive stick in my dad's Miata, and she picked it up pretty quick. And don't let cold climate discourage you from soft-top Miata ownership, as removable hardtops like this one are popular options for keeping warm in those winter months. Good examples of these little Mazdas can be purchased for around 6 to 12 grand, thousands less than a comparable Corvette. So if you want a first car that's as fun and cheap as a box of fresh donuts, give the Miata MX-5 a look. So in conclusion, would I recommend a C4 or C5 Corvette as a first car? Not in most cases. In my opinion, the average beginning driver won't have the budget, mechanical experience, or vehicle awareness that retro Corvettes require. But if you're in love with the idea of vet ownership, and if you have the budget, hey, I love seeing young drivers in Corvettes. The last thing I want to do is discourage you. I just want to make sure you go into the experience knowing what to expect. For everyone else, I think my Mustang or Miata alternatives will make a lot more sense. I'm personally glad that I owned those cheaper and slower cars before moving up to my Corvette. You gotta walk before you run, and I learned a lot of valuable driving and mechanical lessons from each of them that I could then apply towards happy Corvette ownership. So while a Corvette might not make an ideal first car for most, I see it as a great vehicle to work your way up to. But let's hear from you in the comments below. What do you think about Corvette ownership at an early age? And what would you recommend as a good, fun first car? And before you go, please subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so you don't miss more Retro Cars Forever coming to you soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.